The Duke sent his guard to spy on the maid, but what they saw in the snow that night haunts him still. The ballroom of Brackenmere Hall glittered with the cold brilliance of 100 candles, yet even their warm glow could not melt the ice in the Duke of Ravenswood's eyes. Dominic Blackwood stood at the edge of the gathering, his tall figure casting a shadow across the marble floor, as he watched his guests with the detached interest of a man who had long since ceased to find pleasure in such trivial amusements. The snow fell silently beyond the tall windows, a perfect counterpoint to the strained gaiety within. "She moved like a ghost through the east wing again last night, Your Grace," murmured Lord Tallis, the Duke's most trusted guard and confidant. The maid, Winters, taking the servants' passage toward the garden door. The Duke's gaze narrowed, his fingers tightening imperceptibly around the stem of his crystal glass. "At what hour?" "Well past midnight, when all others slept. It marks the 3rd time this fortnight." A muscle tensed in the Duke's jaw. Since her arrival 6 months prior, Helena Winters had been a curiosity among the staff, a woman of obvious education reduced to service, who performed her duties with quiet efficiency and kept her gaze downcast in his presence. Yet there was something in the way she carried herself, in the occasional flash of defiance in her amber eyes, that had caught his attention and would not release it. "Perhaps she simply walks to clear her thoughts," suggested the Duke's sister, Lady Eleanor, who had approached silently. "Not everyone harbours dark secrets, brother." "Everyone harbours secrets, Eleanor. It is merely a question of how dark they may be." The Duke set down his untouched drink. "The question is why a lady's maid would risk her position to wander the grounds in the dead of winter." Lady Eleanor's fan snapped open with a sound like breaking ice. "You see conspiracy where there is perhaps only solitude. Has your heart grown so cold, Dominic?" The assembled nobility continued their dance around them, oblivious to the tension. Lady Harrington passed by with her daughter, both casting appreciative glances at the Duke, whose fortune and title made him the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties, despite his notorious austerity of character. "Your Grace," Lord Tallis spoke again, his voice lower, "there is something else. She carries a small bundle with her each time, and she returns without it." The Duke's expression hardened. 6 months earlier, delicate negotiations regarding his northern properties had been compromised, information known only to those within his household. A week before that, Helena Winters had joined his staff, recommended by an acquaintance whose judgment he had never before questioned. "Follow her tonight," the Duke commanded, his voice carrying the quiet authority that brooked no argument. "Take Ellis with you. I want to know what she carries, where she goes, and to whom she speaks." "Yes, Your Grace." Lord Tallis bowed and departed, leaving the Duke alone with his suspicions. As the orchestra paused between selections, the Duke found himself staring at a red silk ribbon that had fallen upon the floor, precisely the shade he had glimpsed around Helena Winters' throat when she thought herself unobserved. He stooped to retrieve it, the silk cool against his fingers. "A lovely trinket, is it not?" Lady Harrington appeared at his side, her smile calculating. Though hardly suitable for a maid, one wonders how such a girl might afford such finery. The Duke tucked the ribbon into his waistcoat pocket. "One wonders indeed, madam." As the snow continued to fall, casting its silent blanket over the estate, the Duke could not suppress the feeling that something momentous approached, something that would alter the carefully ordered world over which he presided. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes like the restless fingers of fate itself. Lord Tallis reappeared at the edge of the ballroom, his expression grave as he caught the Duke's eye and gave a slight nod. The message was clear. Helena Winters was on the move. "Excuse me, Lady Harrington. I find I require some air." The Duke bowed curtly and strode from the ballroom, his steps echoing against the marble as the orchestra resumed its melancholy waltz. The night awaited, cold and unforgiving, as the Duke moved toward his study. There, from the tall windows overlooking the east gardens, he would watch as his guards uncovered whatever secret Helena Winters had buried in the snow. The Duke's study stood in darkness, save for the pale moonlight that spilled across the heavy oak desk. Dominic Blackwood did not light a lamp. He preferred the shadows as he gazed through the leaded glass at the snow-covered gardens below. His breath fogged the cold pane as he waited, one hand absently toying with the red silk ribbon in his pocket. "Your Grace." Ellis, the younger of his 2 guards, entered with a soft knock. "Lord Tallis has positioned himself near the servants' door. The maid has just left the house." "Good." The Duke did not turn from the window. "You will join him presently. Remember, observe only. Do not intervene unless she meets with someone." As Ellis departed, the Duke pressed his forehead against the glass, its chill a welcome distraction from the peculiar unease that had settled in his chest. Below, a slender figure emerged from the servants' entrance, wrapped in a dark cloak that billowed around her ankles. Helena Winters moved with surprising grace across the snow-covered lawn, leaving a trail of delicate footprints in her wake. In her arms, she carried a small bundle wrapped in blue cloth. The Duke's eyes narrowed. What could be so precious that she would risk her reputation, perhaps even her position, to carry it into the winter night? "What secret drives you, Miss Winters?" he whispered against the glass. He had investigated her background thoroughly upon her arrival. Helena Winters, age 5 and 20, formerly employed by the Harrington household. References impeccable, manner reserved but competent. No family save for a brother who had reportedly died in service to another noble house. Nothing to suggest duplicity. And yet, the Duke watched as she made her way toward the small copse of trees at the eastern edge of the property, beyond the formal gardens. Two darker shadows, Tallis and Ellis, moved silently in her wake, keeping to the shelter of the hedgerows. The memory of Helena's face rose unbidden in his mind. He had observed her often from a distance, the quiet dignity with which she performed her duties, the occasional flash of intelligence in her eyes when she thought herself unobserved. Once, he had come upon her in the library, reading a volume of poetry that had belonged to his late mother. She had been so absorbed that she did not notice his presence until he spoke, and the look of startled guilt on her face had stayed with him for days afterward. "The girl reads Tennyson," Lady Eleanor had remarked when he mentioned the incident. "Hardly evidence of treachery, Dominic, but the Duke of Ravenswood had built his reputation on caution. After his father's ruin and death, the result of misplaced trust, Dominic had vowed never to allow sentiment to cloud his judgment. His estate had flourished under his careful stewardship, his investments had multiplied, and his political influence had grown, all because he trusted no one completely." Below, Helena Winters had reached the small grove of trees. The Duke strained to see as she knelt in the snow beside a gnarled oak, the bundle still clutched to her chest. Tallis and Ellis had stopped at the edge of the copse, keeping watch from behind the trunk of a large elm. For several minutes nothing happened. The maid knelt motionless in the snow, her head bowed as if in prayer. Then, with deliberate care, she began to dig into the frozen ground with what appeared to be a small trowel she had produced from beneath her cloak. "What in God's name?" the Duke murmured, his breath clouding the glass. Helena worked steadily, the effort evident in the set of her shoulders. After several minutes she set aside the trowel and placed the blue-wrapped bundle reverently into the hole she had created. She remained kneeling for a moment longer, her lips moving as if in prayer. Then she retrieved something small from within the bundle, the Duke could not discern what, and pressed it to her lips before returning it to its place. As she began to refill the hole, covering whatever she had buried, the Duke was struck by the solemnity of her movements. This was no furtive act, but rather a ritual performed with care and gravity. A sharp knock at the study door broke his concentration. "Enter," he commanded, irritation edging his voice. Lady Eleanor swept in, still in her ball gown, a look of exasperation on her face. "Really, Dominic, abandoning your own guests? Lady Harrington is quite put out, and her daughter has been making cow eyes at the empty doorway for the past half hour." "I have matters of greater importance than Miss Harrington's disappointed affections," he replied curtly, returning his gaze to the window. Eleanor followed his line of sight, her expression softening as she glimpsed the lone figure in the snow. "So you are spying on your servants now? How very noble of you." "I am protecting my household," he corrected. "That maid has been behaving suspiciously for weeks. By walking in the snow? Perhaps she simply prefers solitude to the stuffiness of the servants' quarters." Lady Eleanor sighed. "Not everyone who seeks privacy harbors ill intent, brother." The Duke did not reply. Below, Helena had finished her task and was rising to her feet, brushing snow from her cloak. For a moment, she stood perfectly still, her face lifted to the falling snow, and even from this distance the Duke could see the glitter of tears on her cheeks. Something twisted in his chest, an emotion he could not immediately identify. He had expected to witness conspiracy, perhaps even treachery. Instead, he had observed what appeared to be an act of private mourning. "She weeps," he said softly, more to himself than to his sister. "Then perhaps you should grant her the dignity of grief unobserved," Eleanor replied. With a rustle of silk she departed, leaving the Duke alone with his confusion. As Helena Winters made her way back toward the servants' entrance, the Duke's fingers closed around the red ribbon in his pocket. Tomorrow he would have answers. He would summon her to his study and demand an explanation for her nocturnal activities. He would determine whether she posed a threat to his household or was merely a woman with sorrows of her own. What he could not have known as he watched her disappear into the night was how profoundly that explanation would shake the foundations of his carefully ordered world. Dawn broke cold and clear over Brackenmere Hall, the rising sun casting long blue shadows across the snow-covered grounds. The Duke had slept little, his dreams haunted by the image of Helena Winters kneeling in the snow, tears glittering on her face like diamonds. He stood now at his study window, watching as the household stirred to life, servants moving with quiet efficiency to prepare the great house for another day. Lord Tallis had reported back shortly after midnight, his account confirming what the Duke had witnessed from afar. The maid had buried something beneath the old oak tree, a small wooden box containing what appeared to be a child's portrait and a locket. She had spoken no words aloud, met with no conspirators. Her crime, if such it could be called, was one of private remembrance. "She prayed, Your Grace," Tallis had said, a note of discomfort in his voice, "and wept, nothing more." The Duke had dismissed him with instructions to retrieve whatever had been buried once the household was asleep. Now the small wooden box sat upon his desk, its contents laid bare. A miniature portrait of a young man with Helena's same amber eyes, a silver locket containing a lock of dark hair, and a carefully folded letter, the paper yellowed with age. He had read the letter twice, each word a blow to his conscience. It was addressed to Helena from her brother, Eamon Winters, written 2 days before his death. Her death, the Duke now understood with sickening clarity, that had occurred while the young man was in service to the previous Duke of Ravenswood, Dominic's father. "Your Grace." His steward, Mr. Pembroke, appeared at the study door. "Miss Winters has been summoned as you requested." "Send her in," the Duke replied, his voice betraying none of the turmoil within. When Helena Winters entered, she did so with the quiet dignity he had observed before, though her complexion was paler than usual. She curtsied precisely, her gaze fixed on a point just beyond his shoulder. "You wish to see me, Your Grace?" "Indeed, Miss Winters." The Duke gestured to the items displayed on his desk. "Perhaps you might explain the purpose of your nocturnal excursions." Her gaze fell upon the box and its contents, and for a moment naked anguish crossed her features before she composed herself once more. When she spoke, her voice was steady, though barely above a whisper. "You had me followed." "I did." He made no apology for it. "You have been seen leaving the house on multiple occasions, carrying a bundle into the grounds. Such behavior demands explanation." Helena's eyes met his directly for the first time, and the Duke was startled by the quiet defiance he saw there. "I buried mementos of my brother, Your Grace. Yesterday marked the 2nd anniversary of his death. I meant no harm by it." "Your brother." The Duke's finger tapped the edge of the miniature. "Eamon Winters. He was in service to this house." "Yes, Your Grace." Her hands were clasped tightly before her, the knuckles white. "He was a footman here for 3 years, until he was sent to deliver a message to your northern estate during the great storm of '43. The Duke felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He had been abroad when the incident occurred, but he recalled the letter from his father, mentioning in passing the loss of a servant during a blizzard. A regrettable necessity, his father had called it, as the message could not wait. "He froze to death," Helena continued, her voice acquiring an edge. "The horse went lame 5 miles from shelter, and the message your father deemed so urgent could not wait for fairer weather. And yet you sought employment in this house." The Duke's voice was soft with dangerous inquiry. "Why?" A tremor passed through her frame. "I needed the position, Your Grace, and I wished to see the place where Eamon had spent his final years, to understand what had been worth his life." The Duke rose from behind his desk, moving to the window that overlooked the snow-covered gardens. The oak tree stood stark against the whiteness, a silent sentinel over Helena's buried memories. "And have you found your answer, Miss Winters?" "I have found that great houses run on the lives of those deemed dispensable," she replied, a thread of bitterness woven through her words. "That a man may die delivering a letter while his master sits warm by the fire, and it shall be called duty rather than cruelty." The Duke turned sharply, anger flaring at her insolence, but the accusation in her eyes, calm, direct, unflinching, gave him pause. This was not the deference to which he was accustomed, yet neither was it the malice he might have expected from one harboring a grudge. "My father," he said carefully, "was not known for his compassion." "No, Your Grace." A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "They say the son is cut from different cloth." The Duke felt an uncomfortable stirring of conscience. He had spent years dismantling his father's more ruinous policies, improving conditions for his tenants and servants. Yet he had never considered the human cost of the messages that crossed his desk daily, the orders he issued with the expectation of immediate obedience. "You said the box contained mementos," he said, changing course. "Yet I find also a letter, one that speaks of returning something to its rightful place." Helena's composure faltered. "That is a private matter, Your Grace." "There are no private matters in my household, Miss Winters." He lifted the letter. "Your brother mentions a document, one that could restore what was taken. Explain." A flush rose to her cheeks. "It is nothing that would interest Your Grace. A small parcel of land near our childhood home, lost to taxes after our parents died. Eamon believed he had discovered proof that the assessment was in error, but he never had the chance to pursue it." The Duke studied her face, searching for any sign of deception. Finding none, he returned to his desk and gathered the items, placing them carefully back into the wooden box. "You will not bury this again," he said firmly. "The ground is consecrated for a reason, Miss Winters. If you wish to honor your brother's memory, there are more appropriate ways." He expected protest, perhaps even tears. Instead, Helena straightened her shoulders and regarded him with a composure that was almost regal in its restraint. "As you wish, Your Grace. May I be excused?" The Duke hesitated, then held out the box. "Take this. Keep it where it belongs. With you." Surprise flashed across her features, quickly replaced by wariness. She accepted the box with careful hands, as if it might shatter at her touch. "Thank you, Your Grace." As she turned to leave, the Duke found himself speaking again, driven by an impulse he did not fully understand. "Miss Winters, the document your brother mentioned, if it exists, I would see it." She paused at the door, her back to him. "And if it should prove my family was wronged, then I shall see the wrong righted," he replied, surprising himself with his vehemence. Helena turned, studying him with those remarkable amber eyes. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, waited with unspoken challenge. Then she nodded once, a gesture somehow both acquiescence and warning. "I shall hold you to that promise, Your Grace." After she had gone, the Duke remained at his window, watching as the day brightened around Brackenmere Hall. The red silk ribbon lay forgotten on his desk, a vivid splash of colour against the dark wood. Outside, the oak tree stood silent in its snowy vigil, keeper of secrets that were buried deeper than any box could be placed. And in the Duke's mind, the image of Helena Winters kneeling in the snow remained, a reproach and a mystery he could not put aside. A fortnight passed, Winter's grip tightening around Brackenmere Hall as January deepened. The Duke found himself watching Helena Winters with newfound awareness whenever their paths crossed. In the long gallery as she assisted Lady Eleanor, in the library where she sometimes lingered after delivering messages, in the great hall where her figure would slip quietly through the shadows, as if reluctant to be noticed. He had not spoken to her since their confrontation in his study, yet the memory of her steady gaze haunted him. The promised document had not materialized, and the Duke found himself both relieved and strangely disappointed by its absence. "You seem distracted of late, brother," Lady Eleanor remarked one evening, as they sat before the fire in the drawing-room. Outside, snow fell in thick curtains, muffling the world beyond the windows. "Is it the proposal from Lord Harrington? I told you his terms were unreasonable." The Duke swirled the brandy in his glass, watching the firelight play across the amber liquid. "It is not Harrington." Eleanor's needlework paused. "Ah, is it perhaps a certain maid with remarkable eyes? I've noticed how you watch her." Dominic shot his sister a warning glance. "I watch all my servants, Eleanor. It is my responsibility to know what occurs under my roof." "Of course." Her needle resumed its delicate path through the silk. Though most masters do not look at their servants as though they present a most intriguing puzzle to be solved, before he could formulate a suitably cutting response, a soft knock at the door heralded Mr. Pembroke. The steward entered with his customary gravity, bearing a silver salver upon which rested a sealed letter. "A messenger has just arrived, Your Grace, from the solicitor in London." The Duke accepted the letter with a frown. "At this hour? In this weather?" The man nearly froze crossing the moors, Your Grace. He insisted it was most urgent. As the steward withdrew, Dominic broke the seal and scanned the contents, his expression darkening with each line. Eleanor, knowing her brother's moods, set aside her needlework. "Troubling news." "Most troubling," he confirmed, rising to pour himself another measure of brandy. "It appears our father's business dealings were even more questionable than we had believed. The solicitor has uncovered evidence of falsified tax assessments on several properties adjoining our northern estate." Eleanor's brow furrowed. "Falsified in whose favor?" In ours, naturally. The Duke's voice was bitter. The previous owners were driven to ruin by taxes they could not possibly pay, allowing father to purchase their lands at a fraction of their worth. But surely such matters are long settled. It has been 5 years since father's death. The Duke returned to his seat, the letter crumpled in his fist. The solicitor writes that one of the affected families has come forward with documentation proving the fraud. The courts may require restitution. Eleanor's eyes widened. Which family? A knock interrupted them, louder, more urgent than Pembroke's deferential tap. The Duke called for entry, and to his surprise, Helena Winters stepped into the room, her face flushed with what might have been cold or agitation. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace," she said, curtsying quickly to both siblings. "I would not disturb you at this hour, were it not a matter of some importance." The Duke rose, acutely aware of his sister's keen observation. "What is it, Miss Winters?" Helena extended her hand, in which she held a folded packet of papers, yellowed with age and tied with faded blue ribbon. "The document my brother mentioned in his letter. I have only just retrieved it from where he had hidden it before his final journey." The Duke accepted the packet, his fingers brushing against hers for the briefest moment. Her skin was cold, suggesting she had indeed been outdoors. "You've been to the oak tree again," he stated, rather than asked. "Not the tree itself, Your Grace." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Eamon knew better than to bury valuable papers in the earth. He left them in a hollow at the base of the statue of Diana in the East Garden, protected from the elements. As the Duke untied the ribbon and unfolded the papers, Eleanor rose with a rustle of silk. "I shall leave you to your business matters, Dominic. Miss Winters." She nodded to the maid, with a knowing smile that caused colour to rise in Helena's cheeks. Alone with Helena, the Duke scanned the documents with growing dismay. They were exactly what his solicitor had warned of, proof that his father had conspired with a corrupt tax assessor to drive several families from their lands. Among them, prominently featured, was the name Winters. "Your family owned Hawthorne Cottage and the surrounding 10 acres, he said quietly, meeting her gaze. "Yes, Your Grace." Her voice was steady, though her hands were clasped tightly before her. "For 3 generations, until the assessor came and claimed we owed more in taxes than the land itself was worth. My parents died of fever shortly after we were forced to leave. Eamon and I entered service to survive." The Duke returned to his chair, gesturing for Helena to take the seat his sister had vacated. She hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and the need to pursue her cause. "Sit, Miss Winters," he commanded, though gently. "We have matters to discuss, and I would not have you standing like a supplicant." She perched on the edge of the chair, her back straight as a lance. "I do not come seeking charity, Your Grace, only justice." "Justice." The Duke tapped the papers against his knee. A complicated word, particularly when applied to the sins of the past. "These documents would indeed support your claim in court, though the proceedings would be lengthy and expensive." "I am prepared for that," she replied, a flash of her brother's determination in her eyes. "I have saved every penny these 5 years." The Duke studied her, struck once more by the quiet dignity that seemed her most defining characteristic. Here was no scheming servant seeking advantage, but a woman wronged who sought only what was rightfully hers. "There would be no need for courts," he said finally. "I shall restore your family's property to you, along with appropriate compensation for the years lost." Helena's composure faltered, genuine shock crossing her features. "Your Grace, I am not my father, Miss Winters," he interrupted, rising to stand before the fire. The flames cast his shadow long across the carpet, reaching toward her like an unspoken promise. "I do not build my fortune on the suffering of others." She stood as well, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Why would you do this? You owe me nothing." The Duke thought of her brother, dying alone in the snow for the sake of a message that likely could have waited. He thought of Helena, kneeling in the winter night, burying memories because she had no grave to visit. And he thought of his own father, whose legacy of cruelty he had spent years trying to erase. "Perhaps I owe more than either of us realized," he replied softly. Their eyes met across the firelit room, and something passed between them, an understanding that transcended their respective stations. For the first time, the Duke saw not the maid, but the woman, intelligent, resilient, possessed of a moral strength that humbled him. "It will take some time to arrange the transfer," he continued, breaking the moment before it could deepen into something he was not prepared to confront. "In the meantime, you will continue your duties here as before." "Yes, Your Grace." She curtsied, the movement graceful despite her evident emotion. I shall never forget this kindness." As she turned to leave, the Duke called after her, compelled by an impulse he did not fully understand. "Miss Winters." She paused at the door, looking back over her shoulder. In the firelight, her profile was like something from a Renaissance painting. Proud, pure, touched with sorrow, yet unbowed by it. "The ribbon you wore," he said. "The red silk. I found it in the ballroom the night I had you followed." A faint smile touched her lips. "It was my mother's, Your Grace. The last beautiful thing she owned. I wear it on days when I need her strength." With those words she was gone, leaving the Duke alone with the fire, the papers that proved his father's perfidy, and the lingering scent of lavender that seemed to hang in the air where she had stood. February arrived with bitter winds that howled around the chimneys of Brackenmere Hall like restless spirits seeking entry. Within the great house, however, an unexpected warmth had begun to thaw the Duke's habitual reserve. Servants noted with surprise his increased presence in parts of the house previously left to their domain: the linen room where he inquired about the quality of the bed hangings, the still room where he expressed interest in the making of preserves, the library at hours when a certain maid might be dusting the shelves. "I've never seen him in such spirits," Mrs. Graves, the housekeeper, confided to Pembroke as they tallied the household accounts one evening. "Twice this week he's asked after the comfort of the staff quarters." The steward's response was non-committal, though his eyes held a knowing gleam. "His Grace has always taken an interest in the welfare of the household." "Not like this," Mrs. Graves insisted, "and not with such particular attention to one member of the staff." For indeed the Duke's interactions with Helena Winters had increased markedly since the night she brought him the documents. He sought her opinion on books that might interest Lady Eleanor, consulted her regarding improvements to the servants' hall, even lingered in rooms where her duties brought her, initiating conversations that began with household matters but often strayed to literature, music, or memories of the countryside where she had grown up. For her part, Helena maintained the proper deference due his station, yet the Duke noted how her reserve had softened, how her eyes now met his directly when they spoke, how she no longer seemed to fade into shadows at his approach. There was a new ease between them, fragile, unnamed, but undeniably present. "You are playing a dangerous game, Dominic," Lady Eleanor warned him one afternoon as they rode across the snow-covered estate. "The staff have begun to talk." The Duke adjusted his mount's pace to match his sister's mare. "The staff always talk. It is their primary source of entertainment." "This is different." Eleanor's voice was uncharacteristically serious. "You are the Duke of Ravenswood. She is a lady's maid. However worthy she may be, however unjustly treated by our father, the world will see only the impropriety." "I am merely righting a wrong," he replied stiffly. "The transfer of property requires discussion." "Is that what you call your daily visits to the library when she is working there? Discussion of property?" Eleanor's eyebrow arched skeptically. "Brother, I have not seen you so animated in conversation since before father's death. You smile when she enters a room. You seek reasons to encounter her. If you were any other man, I would say you were courting her." The Duke pulled his horse to a sudden halt, snow flying from its hooves. "I am not courting a servant, Eleanor. Such a suggestion is absurd." "Is it?" His sister's gaze was penetrating. "She is gentle-born, educated, possessed of land once more thanks to your generosity. Were it not for the circumstances that forced her into service, she might well have moved in the same circles as our lesser acquaintances." The Duke stared across the white expanse of his estate, his breath clouding in the cold air. In the distance, the small stone cottage that had once belonged to the Winters family stood empty, awaiting its rightful owner's return. He had ordered it restored over the past fortnight, new thatch laid, windows repaired, furniture delivered from London. "She returns to Hawthorne Cottage next week," he said finally. "The matter will be resolved, and things will return to their proper order." Eleanor's laugh was soft with disbelief. "Do you truly believe that, Dominic? That you can restore her birthright and then forget her existence?" He did not answer, for in truth he could no longer imagine Brackenmere without Helena's quiet presence. The thought of her departure left an emptiness he had not anticipated when he had agreed to return her property. That evening, as twilight settled over the estate, the Duke found himself drawn once more to the old oak tree where he had first witnessed Helena's private grief. The snow had begun to melt in patches, revealing the dark earth beneath. Spring would come eventually, he knew, bringing new growth, new beginnings. For some. "Your Grace?" Her voice behind him was soft with surprise. "I did not expect to find anyone here." The Duke turned to find Helena standing several paces away, a small bundle of winter roses in her gloved hands. She had clearly come to visit the spot where her brother's mementos had briefly rested. "Miss Winters," he inclined his head. "I was merely re-inspecting the grounds." A smile touched her lips, knowing yet gentle. "Of course, Your Grace. The condition of this particular oak must be of great concern to the estate." Her gentle teasing startled him. It had been so long since anyone save Eleanor had dared to speak to him with such unguarded honesty that for a moment he could only stare at her in wonder. "I find I have developed a particular interest in this tree," he admitted, surprising himself with his candor. "It has witnessed things I had not expected to discover at Brackenmere." Helena stepped closer, her boots leaving delicate impressions in the melting snow. "Such as a maid with an inconvenient sense of family loyalty? Such as a woman of remarkable courage," he corrected, "who faced injustice with dignity rather than bitterness." Color rose in her cheeks at his words, visible even in the fading light. "You speak too kindly, Your Grace. I have harbored my share of bitterness these past years." "Yet you sought employment in the very house responsible for your family's ruin," the Duke observed. "That requires a strength of character few possess." Helena laid her roses at the base of the oak tree, her movements deliberate and reverent. "My brother believed in confronting one's fate, not fleeing from it. Look into the face of that which frightens you," he would say, "and you will find it less fearsome than you imagined." "Wise counsel," the Duke murmured. "Though I confess there are some prospects that grow more rather than less daunting upon closer inspection." Their eyes met, and in that moment the barriers of station and circumstance seemed to fade like mist before the sun. Helena stood before him, not as a servant, but as his equal in all ways that truly mattered, in courage, in principle, in the quiet dignity that had drawn him to her from the first. "The cottage is ready," he said abruptly, breaking the spell before it could deepen further. "You may take possession whenever you wish. Pembroke has prepared the papers transferring ownership back to the Winters name." Helena's expression clouded slightly. "You are most generous, Your Grace. I shall inform Lady Eleanor of my departure." "You need not leave service immediately," he hastened to add. "The cottage can wait until you have made suitable arrangements. But surely it would be improper for me to remain in your household once our business is concluded." Her voice was carefully neutral, yet the Duke detected a note of something that might have been regret. "Improper," he repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. Always it came back to propriety, the invisible chains that bound them both to their respective stations. "Yes, I suppose it would be." Silence fell between them, filled with words unspoken, yet felt with painful clarity. In the gathering darkness, Helena's face was a pale oval, her eyes reflecting the last light of day. The Duke found himself memorizing her features, knowing that soon he would no longer have the right to seek her company on such flimsy pretexts. "I should return to the house," she said at last. "Lady Eleanor will be wondering where I am." "Of course." The Duke stepped back, establishing the proper distance between master and servant once more. "Good evening, Miss Winters." She curtsied, the movement as graceful as ever despite the uneven ground. "Good evening, Your Grace." As she walked away, her figure gradually dissolving into the twilight, the Duke remained beneath the oak tree, surrounded by the ghosts of what might have been had they met as equals in another life. The roses Helena had left gleamed dark against the snow, like drops of blood upon a pristine conscience. Dominic Blackwood, the Duke of Ravenswood, had spent a lifetime building walls around his heart. Yet now, as winter reluctantly loosened its grip on Brackenmere Hall, he found those walls crumbling before a force more powerful than frost, the quiet strength of a woman who had every reason to hate him, yet chose instead to show him the meaning of true nobility. The morning of Helena's departure dawned clear and cold, the sky a flawless expanse of blue that mocked the Duke's somber mood. From his study window, he watched as the small carriage was loaded with her few possessions, a trunk, a hat box, several parcels wrapped in brown paper. The staff had gathered to bid her farewell, their affection evident in the small gifts they pressed into her hands: a jar of preserves from Mrs. Graves, a knitted shawl from the scullery maid, a book of poetry from Pembroke. Lady Eleanor stood beside Helena, adjusting the collar of her new cloak, a parting gift from her mistress, the deep blue wool a stark contrast to the serviceable grey she had worn as a maid. They spoke quietly, Eleanor's hand resting on Helena's arm, in a gesture that transcended the usual boundaries between lady and servant. Then, to the Duke's surprise, his sister embraced Helena briefly before stepping back to allow her into the carriage. A sharp knock at the study door broke his vigil. "Enter," he called, not turning from the window. Lord Tallis stepped into the room, his weathered face grave. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace, but there is a matter requiring your immediate attention." "What is it, Tallis?" The Duke's voice betrayed his impatience. Below, the carriage driver had taken his seat, gathering the reins in preparation for departure. "A rider has just arrived from London with urgent news. Lord Harrington has filed a petition with the courts challenging your right to restore the Winters property. He claims his father purchased it legally from yours, despite the irregularities in the original acquisition." The Duke turned sharply. "On what grounds does he make this challenge?" "He alleges that the property was included in a private agreement between your father and his, one that supersedes any claim Miss Winters might have." Tallis hesitated. "There is more, Your Grace. The messenger reports that Harrington has been making inquiries about Miss Winters, her background, her character, her relationship with this household." Anger flared hot and immediate. "Relationship? What precisely is he implying?" "The usual slander, Your Grace, that she has secured your favor through improper means." Tallis's discomfort was evident. "That the restoration of her property is payment for services rendered." The Duke's hands clenched at his sides, rage pulsing through him with each beat of his heart. "Where is this messenger? I would hear his report directly." "In the servants' hall, Your Grace. I thought it best to speak with you privately first." The carriage below had begun to move, gravel crunching beneath the wheels as it pulled away from the house. Helena's figure was visible at the window, her face turned toward the great house for one last look. The Duke fought the urge to call out, to stop her departure until this new threat could be addressed. "Send the messenger up immediately," he ordered. "And find Pembroke. I want those property papers reviewed again before nightfall." As Tallis departed, the Duke returned to the window. The carriage had reached the end of the drive, turning onto the lane that would take Helena away from Brackenmere, away from him. Something twisted painfully in his chest at the sight, a sensation he had not experienced since the loss of his mother many years before. The messenger, when he arrived, confirmed Tallis's report and added several damning details. Harrington had been gathering evidence to suggest that the Duke had developed an inappropriate attachment to a servant, evidence that, while largely circumstantial, would raise eyebrows in London society. The implication was clear: withdraw the property transfer or face social consequences. "That will be all." The Duke dismissed the man curtly after extracting every available detail. Once alone, he paced the length of his study, fury and indecision warring within him. Harrington's challenge was legally dubious but socially damaging, precisely the kind of scandal that could undo years of careful stewardship of the Ravenswood name. Yet the thought of rescinding Helena's inheritance, of betraying the trust that had grown between them, was unbearable. She had suffered enough at the hands of his family. He would not add to that burden, whatever the cost to himself. A soft knock heralded Lady Eleanor's return. She entered without waiting for his invitation, her expression troubled. "She's gone, Dominic, though I suspect you were watching from the window like a lovesick boy in a penny romance." The Duke ignored the jibe. "Harrington is challenging the property transfer," he said without preamble, "and spreading rumors about Helena's character and my interest in her." Eleanor sank into a chair, her brow furrowing. "That odious man never could accept rejection gracefully. His daughter has been throwing herself at you for 2 seasons, and now he seeks revenge for your indifference. This goes beyond petty spite, Eleanor. He means to ruin her reputation, and possibly mine, unless I rescind the transfer. And will you?" His sister's gaze was sharp. "Will you sacrifice her happiness to preserve your precious reputation?" The Duke stared at her, stung by the implicit accusation. "I have already set the papers in motion. The property is legally hers. But you could find a reason to reverse it, some legal technicality, some flaw in the documentation." Eleanor leaned forward. "If you truly care for nothing but the Ravenswood name, as you have claimed these many years." Her words struck him like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the truth he had been avoiding since that snowy night when he had first glimpsed Helena's private grief. The Duke of Ravenswood, who had spent a lifetime guarding his heart against all sentiment, had fallen in love with a lady's maid, not because of her station but despite it, because of her courage, her dignity, her unwavering sense of justice. "I will not take back what is rightfully hers," he said quietly. "Whatever Harrington may say or do." Eleanor's expression softened. "Then you must do more, brother. You must go to her, now before Harrington's poison spreads further." "Go to her?" The Duke stared at his sister in confusion. "To what end?" "Oh, Dominic." Eleanor's exasperation was palpable. For a man of such intelligence, you can be remarkably obtuse. She loves you, you fool. Has loved you since before you even noticed her existence. Why else would she have sought employment in this house, knowing your father's role in her family's ruin? The Duke's heart seemed to stutter in his chest. That's absurd. She came seeking justice for her brother. She came seeking the man her brother had described in his letters. Eleanor corrected him. Eamon Winters served you for a brief period after your return from abroad, before your father sent him on that fatal errand. He wrote to Helena of the young master, who treated servants with respect, who read poetry in the library late at night, who played the pianoforte when he thought no one was listening. The memory rose unbidden in the Duke's mind. A young footman with amber eyes who had once assisted him after a riding accident. They had spoken briefly of books, of music. The Duke had thought nothing of it at the time. You knew this, he demanded. All this time? I suspected. Eleanor rose, smoothing her skirts. Then I found her one evening in the music room, touching the keys of the pianoforte, with such longing that I inquired whether she played. She said no, but that her brother had described the most beautiful music coming from that room when the young master thought himself alone. The Duke stood motionless, overwhelmed by the implications of what his sister was telling him. Helena had come to Brackenmere not merely for justice, but in search of the man her brother had believed him to be, the man he had tried to become in the years since his father's death. The carriage, he said suddenly. How long ago did it leave? Not above half an hour. Eleanor's eyes gleamed with approval. You could catch it before it reaches the village if you ride now. Without another word, the Duke strode from the study, his decision made. Whatever scandal might ensue, whatever society might whisper behind gloved hands, he would not let Helena Winters face Harrington's slander alone, nor would he allow her to disappear from his life without speaking the truth that had been growing in his heart these past months. As he reached the grand staircase, Pembroke appeared with a packet of papers. Your Grace, I've found the original deed to the Winters property. There is something you should... Later, Pembroke. The Duke cut him off, continuing toward the entrance hall. Have my horse saddled immediately. Outside, the February sun shone with surprising warmth, melting the remnants of snow on the drive. As stable boys rushed to prepare his mount, the Duke gazed down the long avenue of bare trees where Helena's carriage had disappeared. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in his life, Dominic Blackwood was following his heart, rather than the dictates of duty and propriety, and strangely, it felt not like weakness, but like the greatest strength he had ever known. The Duke's stallion thundered down the lane, hooves churning the half-melted snow into mud, breath clouding in the crisp air. Dominic rode as he had not ridden in years, with reckless abandon, caring nothing for the dignity of his station or the startled faces of tenants who pressed themselves against hedgerows as he passed. His sole focus was the distant speck of the carriage that had just become visible around a bend in the road. Helena, he whispered, the name carried away by the wind that rushed past his ears. The irony did not escape him, that he who had sent men riding into blizzards without a second thought now braved the elements himself for the sake of a woman society deemed beneath his notice. As he rounded the final curve before the village, the carriage came fully into view, moving at a sedate pace along the rutted road. The Duke spurred his horse onward, drawing alongside the startled driver, who pulled sharply on the reins at the sight of his master. Your Grace, the man touched his cap, eyes wide with confusion. Is something amiss? I must speak with Miss Winters, the Duke replied, dismounting before the carriage had fully stopped. A matter of some urgency. He did not wait for a response, but strode to the carriage door, opening it without ceremony. Inside, Helena sat with her hands folded in her lap, her expression shifting from alarm to recognition to cautious wonder as she beheld him framed in the doorway. Your Grace, she said softly, has something happened? The sight of her, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes wide with concern, struck him with unexpected force. How had he not seen earlier what now seemed so blindingly clear, that this woman, with her quiet strength and uncompromising integrity, had become essential to his existence? Yes, he replied, suddenly conscious of his disheveled appearance, his lack of proper address. That is, something is about to happen. Lord Harrington has filed a petition challenging your right to Hawthorne Cottage. Helena's gloved hands tightened in her lap, but her voice remained steady. On what grounds? He claims the property was included in a private agreement between our fathers. The Duke hesitated, reluctant to reveal the uglier aspects of Harrington's attack. There are also insinuations being made regarding the nature of our acquaintance. Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by a flash of indignation. He suggests impropriety between us to invalidate the transfer. Yes. The Duke found himself admiring anew her quick intelligence, her refusal to hide behind genteel euphemisms. I came to warn you, and to assure you that I will contest his claims with every resource at my disposal. Helena studied him for a long moment, her gaze penetrating. You rode out personally to tell me this. Could not a messenger have sufficed? The question hung between them, weighted with implication. The Duke glanced at the driver, who was studiously examining the harness, then back to Helena, whose face betrayed nothing but calm inquiry. May I join you? He asked abruptly. There is more we must discuss. At her nod, he entered the carriage, settling on the seat opposite her. The small space seemed to shrink further with his presence, the air charged with unspoken possibilities. My sister, he began, then paused, uncertain how to proceed. Eleanor tells me that your brother once served in my household, directly under my supervision for a time. Yes, Helena confirmed, for several months after your return from the continent, before your father sent him north. I remember him, the Duke admitted. Not as clearly as I should, perhaps, but I recall a young footman with unusual eyes. Your eyes. He met her gaze directly. He was intelligent, well-spoken. We discussed poetry once after a riding accident. Something flickered in Helena's expression, surprise, perhaps, that he should remember such a detail. He wrote to me about that conversation. He said you quoted Wordsworth while the physician set your broken arm, never once crying out, despite the pain. The memory returned with unexpected clarity, the sharp agony of the bone being realigned, the young servant's steady presence, the verses he had recited through gritted teeth to distract himself from the pain. The best portion of a good man's life, his little, nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and love, the Duke quoted softly. That best portion of a good man's life, Helena corrected gently, completing the line with a precision that spoke of frequent recitation. A silence fell between them, filled with the creak of the carriage and the distant calls of birds returning with the promise of spring. The Duke found himself studying Helena's face, as if seeing it for the first time, the clear brow, the resolute chin, the eyes that seemed to contain depths no title or fortune could bestow. Why did you really come to Brackenmere? He asked at last. The truth, Helena. Her name on his lips, the first time he had spoken it aloud, changed something in the atmosphere between them. Helena's breath caught audibly, but she did not correct his familiarity. I came for justice, she said slowly. For my brother, for my family, but also, she hesitated, then continued with quiet dignity. I came to see if the man Eamon had described in his letters truly existed, the young master who treated servants as human beings, who valued learning above status, who played music in the darkness because his soul required it. The Duke felt as if a veil had been lifted from his eyes, revealing a truth that had been before him all along. And did you find him? This man your brother believed in? Helena's smile was both sad and luminous. I found a man struggling against the legacy of his father, against the constraints of his position. A man capable of great compassion, yet afraid to show it, lest it be mistaken for weakness. Her insight humbled him. How long had she watched from the shadows, observing the battle he fought daily between duty and inclination? How clearly she had seen him, while he had barely noticed her existence, until that snowy night beneath the oak tree. And now, he pressed, leaning forward slightly. What do you see now, Helena? I see a duke riding through the snow to warn a former servant of a legal challenge, she replied, a hint of teasing in her tone. A most unusual occurrence, Your Grace. Dominic, he corrected impulsively. My name is Dominic. The familiarity hung between them, breathtaking in its impropriety. For a lady's maid to address a duke by his Christian name was unthinkable, yet in this moment, inside this carriage that had been intended to separate them forever, the ancient rules of society seemed as insubstantial as morning mist. Lord Harrington will not be the only one to question your actions, Helena said softly, returning to the practical matter at hand. Society will wonder why you champion my cause so fervently. Let them wonder, the Duke replied, surprising himself with his vehemence. I am weary of living by the dictates of those who have never known true injustice. Yet you have worked so hard to restore the Ravenswood name, Helena reminded him. Would you risk all that for the sake of a small cottage and 10 acres? The Duke reached across the narrow space between them, taking her gloved hand in his. The gesture was bold, intimate, crossing boundaries that had defined their interaction since her arrival at Brackenmere. yet it felt as natural as breathing, as inevitable as the spring that would soon transform the winter landscape. "I would risk it for the sake of the woman who showed me the meaning of true courage," he said, his voice low and fervent. "The woman who faced injustice without bitterness, who reminded me of the man I once aspired to be." Helena's fingers trembled within his grasp, but she did not withdraw. "You speak dangerously, your Dominic. Perhaps it is time for a little danger." He tightened his hold on her hand. "Come back to Brackenmere, Helena, not as a servant, but as my guest. Let us face Harrington's challenge together." Her eyes widened. "That would only confirm the rumors he spreads." "Then let me give him something true to speak of," the Duke said, the words escaping before prudence could restrain them. "Let me court you properly, openly, as a man courts the woman he admires above all others." A stunned silence filled the carriage, broken only by the soft exhale of Helena's breath. She stared at the Duke, at Dominic, as if he had suddenly begun speaking in tongues, her amber eyes wide with disbelief. "Court me," she repeated, her voice barely audible. "Your Grace, you cannot mean—" "I have never been more certain of anything," he interrupted, still holding her hand as if it were the most precious object in his possession. "Helena, these past months have awakened something I believed long dead. You have shown me that true nobility lies not in titles or lands, but in the courage to face injustice with dignity, to remain steadfast when all seems lost." Helena gently withdrew her hand, though the action seemed to cost her considerable effort. "You speak from gratitude, perhaps even admiration. But courtship? Marriage? The scandal would be unprecedented." "I care nothing for scandal," Dominic insisted, though even as he spoke, he recognized the luxury of such a stance. His position allowed him to weather society's disapproval, hers did not. "The world will adapt, as it always does when confronted with the inevitable." "The inevitable?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Is that how you see us, Dominic? As inevitable as the changing seasons?" The use of his name, spoken in her clear voice, sent a current of warmth through him that belied the February chill. "I believe I began falling in love with you the moment I saw you kneeling in the snow, your tears more honest than any words I had heard in years." The confession hung between them, too momentous to be easily accepted, too sincere to be dismissed. Helena's complexion grew pale, then flushed with color, her emotions playing across her face with a transparency that courtly ladies spent years learning to disguise. "You cannot love me," she said at last, though her tone held more wonder than denial. "I was, your servant. We have spoken perhaps a dozen times at length. You know little of me beyond my connection to your father's misdeeds. I know that you read Wordsworth by heart," Dominic countered, "that you prefer roses even in winter, that you walk in the garden at dawn before your duties begin, that your hands are steady even when your heart is breaking, that you forgave a man who did not deserve forgiveness because you saw in him the capacity to be better than his inheritance." Helena's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You have observed me closely, your Grace." "Dominic," he corrected gently, "and yes, I have watched you. At first with suspicion, then with curiosity, finally with an admiration that has grown into something I can no longer deny, even to myself." Outside the carriage, the village of Thornfield came into view, its stone cottages clustered around the ancient church like chicks around a mother hen. Soon they would reach the crossroads, where the lane to Hawthorne Cottage diverged from the main road, the moment of decision. "What you propose is impossible," Helena said, her practical nature reasserting itself. "Even if I returned to Brackenmere as your guest, which would raise eyebrows throughout the county, how could such a courtship proceed? I have no family to chaperone, no fortune to bring to a marriage, no social standing to justify your attention." "You have yourself," Dominic replied simply. "Your intelligence, your courage, your uncompromising sense of justice. Those qualities are worth more than all the dowries in England." Helena shook her head, though whether in denial or amazement at his persistence was unclear. "The world does not share your valuation, Dominic. Lady Harrington and her ilk would cut me dead in the street, while her husband uses every legal means to strip me of my inheritance." "Then we shall face them together," he insisted. "Helena, I am not proposing we rush to the altar tomorrow. I ask only for the chance to know you better, away from the constraints of master and servant, to discover if what I feel, what I believe you feel as well, might flourish in the light of day." The carriage slowed as they approached the crossroads, the driver awaiting instruction on which path to take. Helena gazed out the window at the lane that led to Hawthorne Cottage, to independence, to a quiet life free from scandal and speculation. Then she turned back to Dominic, her expression resolute yet tender. "If I were to consider this madness," she said carefully, "there would be conditions." Hope surged within him. "Name them." "I would return to Brackenmere not as your guest, but as Lady Eleanor's companion, a position more suitable to my birth and education than lady's maid, yet not so elevated as to invite immediate ridicule." Dominic nodded, recognizing the wisdom of her suggestion. "Eleanor would be delighted. She has expressed on multiple occasions how much she enjoys your conversation. Second," Helena continued, "the property transfer must proceed as planned. I will not have anyone suggest that my affection was purchased with land or gold. The papers are already signed," he assured her. "Hawthorne Cottage is yours, whatever else may transpire between us. Third," and here her voice softened, vulnerability showing beneath her composed exterior, "you must promise to reflect carefully on what you propose. The path would not be easy, Dominic. There would be opposition from your peers, perhaps even from the Crown. Your sister's marriage prospects might suffer. Your political influence could wane." The concern in her eyes, not for herself but for him, moved Dominic deeply. How many people in his life had ever considered his welfare above their own advantage? "I have spent a lifetime considering the expectations of others," he replied, "rebuilding what my father nearly destroyed through his greed and cruelty. The Ravenswood name is secure now, the estate's prosperous, the political alliance is stable. Perhaps it is time I considered my own happiness, and yours." Helena's expression remained grave, though a light had kindled in her eyes that had not been there before. "And fourth," she said softly, "you must agree that either of us may end this experiment at any time, with no recrimination. If you discover your feelings were merely a passing fancy, or if I find the scrutiny too harsh to bear, we part as friends, with dignity intact." "Agreed," Dominic said without hesitation, "though I have no doubt of my own constancy. It is your heart I hope to win, Helena Winters, with patience and devotion if necessary." The carriage had stopped completely now, the driver waiting with increasing confusion for his instructions. Through the window, Dominic could see Hawthorne Cottage in the distance, a small, sturdy structure with a freshly thatched roof and smoke rising from the chimney. He had ordered a fire lit and provisions stocked in anticipation of Helena's arrival. It could still be hers alone, if she chose. Helena followed his gaze, a wistfulness crossing her features. "I have dreamed of that cottage since childhood," she murmured, "of tending its garden, of sitting by its hearth, of being mistress of my own domain, however humble." "It will always be yours," Dominic promised. "A sanctuary when the world proves too harsh, a legacy to pass to your children." He hesitated, then added softly, "Our children, perhaps one day." The boldness of the suggestion brought a deeper flush to Helena's cheeks, but she did not rebuke him for it. Instead, she turned from the window to face him directly, her decision evident in the set of her shoulders. "Tell the driver to return to Brackenmere," she said quietly. "I find I am not yet ready to leave its shelter." Joy surged through Dominic like a spring tide, powerful enough to sweep away years of careful restraint. He leaned forward, intent on sealing their understanding with a kiss, but Helena placed a gentle finger against his lips. "Patience, Your Grace," she admonished, though her eyes sparkled with barely suppressed emotion. "If we are to attempt this impossible courtship, we must observe at least some of society's forms." Dominic captured her hand, pressing a fervent kiss to her palm instead, a gesture intimate enough to be scandalous, yet restrained enough to honor her wishes. "As you command, Miss Winters, though I warn you, my patience has already been sorely tested these past months." The smile that illuminated her face was worth every moment of uncertainty, every risk that lay ahead. "Then we are evenly matched, Dominic Blackwood," she replied, "for mine has been tested since the day I first set foot in Brackenmere Hall." March roared into existence with winds that bent the newly budding trees and rattled the windows of Brackenmere Hall. Within the great house, an equally powerful force of change had taken hold, transforming the once somber atmosphere into one of cautious optimism. The Duke's decision to elevate Helena Winters to the position of Lady Eleanor's companion had sparked curiosity among the staff and tenants, but his sister's enthusiastic endorsement had quelled the initial whispers. "Miss Winters has been a godsend," Lady Eleanor declared to Mrs. Graves as they reviewed the spring cleaning schedule. "Her organizational skills are impeccable, and her taste in literature aligns perfectly with mine. I cannot imagine how I managed without her all these years." The housekeeper, no fool despite her careful neutrality, merely nodded. "Indeed, my lady, Miss Winters has always shown exceptional capability." If Mrs. Graves noticed how frequently the Duke found reason to join his sister for tea in the morning room, or how often Lady Eleanor developed sudden headaches that required her to retire early, leaving her brother and companion to continue their discussions alone. She kept such observations to herself. The staff, following her lead, maintained a discreet silence regarding the changing relationship between their master and the former maid. For Helena, the transition had been both simpler and more complex than anticipated. Her duties as companion were less physically demanding than those of a lady's maid, allowing her more time for reading, correspondence, and the tentative courtship that was unfolding behind Brackenmere's protective walls. Yet the weight of scrutiny from the outside world pressed upon her with increasing urgency as news of her elevation spread through county society. "Lady Harrington has called off her dinner party," Lady Eleanor announced one afternoon as she entered the library, where Helena sat writing letters. Apparently, half the guest list declined upon learning we would be in attendance, including, I might add, several who owe their solvency to Dominic's financial assistance during the bad harvest 2 years ago. Helena set down her pen, her expression troubled. "I feared this would happen. Your brother's association with me is becoming a liability to your family's social position." "Nonsense." Eleanor waved away the concern with an imperious flick of her wrist. "The Harringtons are nouveau riche upstarts with delusions of grandeur. Their disapproval is a compliment to your character, if anything." Despite her brave words, Helena knew that Eleanor felt the sting of social rejection more keenly than she admitted. Born to privilege and raised to expect deference, Lady Eleanor Blackwood had never before experienced the cut direct from those she considered her peers. "The case proceeds," Helena said, changing the subject to the matter that had occupied much of the Duke's attention these past weeks. "Lord Harrington's solicitor has filed additional documents challenging the property transfer." Eleanor snorted inelegantly. "On what grounds this time? That you enchanted Dominic with witchcraft? The man grows increasingly desperate." "His desperation makes him dangerous," Helena replied softly. "I sometimes wonder if I should simply relinquish the claim to Hawthorne Cottage, rather than subject your family to continued scandal." "And surrender to injustice?" The Duke's voice came from the doorway, where he stood observing them, with a frown creasing his brow. "I thought you of all people would recognize the importance of standing firm against such tactics." Helena rose, a smile warming her features despite her concerns. In the weeks since their fateful carriage ride, she had grown accustomed to the way her heart quickened at Dominic's approach, the way his presence seemed to fill any room he entered. Their courtship, conducted largely within the confines of Brackenmere, had deepened from tentative conversations to an easy companionship built on shared values and mutual respect. "I merely consider all possibilities," she replied, meeting his gaze with the directness that still startled those accustomed to feminine deference, particularly those that might spare others unnecessary pain. "Very noble," Eleanor commented dryly, "but utterly misguided. Harrington would see your surrender as validation of his tactics, not as a magnanimous gesture." The Duke crossed to Helena's side, taking her hand in a gesture that had become natural between them, though still reserved for private moments. "I've received word from London," he said, his thumb tracing absent patterns across her knuckles. "The courts have dismissed Harrington's petition. The property transfer stands." Joy flooded Helena's face. "Truly? Then it's over?" "The legal battle, yes." Dominic's expression remained grave. "The social one may yet escalate. Harrington is not a man to accept defeat gracefully." Eleanor rose, smoothing her skirts with deliberate precision. "I suddenly feel a headache coming on. If you'll excuse me, I believe I shall lie down before dinner." With a pointed look at her brother, she swept from the room, closing the door firmly behind her. Alone with Helena, Dominic's formal posture relaxed, the weight of ducal authority slipping from his shoulders like a discarded cloak. These private moments had become precious to them both, opportunities to speak freely, to learn each other's minds, without the constraints of rank and propriety. "You are troubled," Helena observed, studying the lines of tension around his eyes. "What aren't you telling me?" Dominic released her hand with reluctance, moving to gaze out the library window at the gardens below, where the first green shoots of spring were emerging from the thawing earth. "Harrington has taken his grievances to the House of Lords. Not the legal petition, that is indeed settled, but rather his concerns about my judgment and fitness to manage the Ravenswood estates." Helena went still. "Because of me." "Because of his wounded pride," Dominic corrected, turning back to her. "You are merely the convenient excuse. He has coveted our northern properties for years, and this presented an opportunity to suggest that I am acting irrationally, perhaps even incompetently. Will they listen to him? Helena asked, her practical nature focusing immediately on the threat rather than the insult. Some will. Those who remember my father's excesses, who have been waiting for the son to show similar tendencies. Dominic's mouth twisted in a bitter smile. The Duke of Ravenswood, besotted with a servant girl, giving away valuable property on a whim. It confirms their worst suspicions about inherited power. The description, deliberately cruel in its simplicity, made Helena flinch. When you phrase it thus, I can almost understand their concern. Helena. Dominic crossed to her in 2 swift strides, taking her by the shoulders. Do not allow Harrington's malice to plant seeds of doubt. What exists between us is neither a passing fancy nor a symptom of mental decline. It is the most rational choice I have ever made. She met his gaze, drawing strength from the unwavering conviction she saw there. What will you do about the lords? I shall address them directly, he replied. I have requested an audience to present the full history of the Winters property, including my father's fraudulent acquisition. I will make it clear that this was an act of justice, not infatuation. Helena's brow furrowed. And our arrangement. Will you speak of that as well? Dominic hesitated, his hands tightening slightly on her shoulders. I had thought to keep our personal matters separate from the legal justification, to focus on the merits of the case rather than my private life. In other words, to conceal the truth of our relationship. Helena's voice held no accusation, merely a calm assessment of reality. Perhaps that would be wisest for now. A shadow crossed Dominic's face. I dislike subterfuge. It feels like acknowledging shame where there is none. It is not shame but strategy, Helena countered gently. The lords will judge the property transfer more fairly if they are not distracted by speculation about us. Once that matter is settled beyond dispute, we can address the personal aspects from a position of strength. The rational approach was so characteristic of Helena that Dominic found himself smiling despite the seriousness of their situation. From their first proper conversation, he had been struck by her ability to separate emotion from practicality, to face difficult truths without flinching from their implications. You would have made a formidable duchess, he said softly, the words escaping before prudence could restrain them. Helena's eyes widened at the implied future, a flush rising to her cheeks. I believe you are getting rather ahead of yourself, Your Grace. Dominic, he corrected automatically, his gaze never leaving her face, and perhaps I am. But I find myself thinking of the future with increasing frequency these days. The admission hung between them, weighty with possibility. Since their return to Brackenmere, they had spoken little of long-term expectations, focusing instead on the immediate challenges of establishing Helena in her new position and defending her right to Hawthorne Cottage. The courtship itself had progressed with careful restraint. Shared conversations, chaperoned walks in the garden, occasional touches of hands when they believed themselves unobserved. What future do you envision? Helena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. When you permit yourself to look beyond the present difficulties. Dominic lifted one hand to cup her cheek, a gesture of tenderness that sent warmth cascading through her. I see Brackenmere filled with light and laughter again. I see children running through these somber halls, unafraid of shadows. I see us growing old together, reading poetry by the fire when our joints are too stiff for walking in the gardens. The vision was so achingly beautiful, so far removed from the life Helena had expected after her family's ruin, that tears sprang to her eyes. You make it sound possible, she murmured, as if we need only wish it so. Not wish, Dominic replied, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped to trail down her cheek. Work for it. Fight for it. Persist until the world accepts what we already know to be true, that some connections transcend the artificial boundaries of rank and fortune. Helena covered his hand with her own, turning her face to press a kiss to his palm, the same intimate gesture he had once shown her in the carriage. Then we shall work together, as we have since the beginning. The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway prompted them to step apart, resuming a more proper distance before the door opened to admit Pembroke. The steward's expression betrayed nothing as he announced that a messenger had arrived from London with urgent correspondence for His Grace. Thank you, Pembroke, Dominic said, his ducal mask firmly back in place. I shall attend to it immediately. As Helena watched him depart, straight-backed and resolute, she felt a curious mixture of pride and trepidation. The battle ahead would test them both, not merely their feelings for each other, but their courage to stand firm against a society that valued conformity above all else. Yet in that moment, with the memory of Dominic's touch still warm upon her skin, Helena Winters felt a certainty that transcended doubt. Whatever challenges awaited, they would face them together, with the same quiet strength that had brought them thus far. And perhaps in time, the future he envisioned might indeed become reality. April arrived at Brackenmere with an explosion of green, the gardens transformed by daffodils and crocuses that dotted the lawns like scattered jewels. Inside the great house, an equally significant transformation was underway. As preparations were made for the Duke's journey to London, the House of Lords had granted his request for an audience, setting a date that allowed barely a fortnight for preparation. "You have all the necessary documents?" Helena asked, reviewing the leather portfolio that Dominic had assembled for his presentation. They sat together in the morning room, spring sunshine streaming through the tall windows, illuminating the papers spread across the table between them. "Everything is in order," he assured her, his expression reflecting the gravity of what lay ahead. "Father's correspondence with the tax assessor, the original property deeds, your brother's testimony regarding the inflated valuation. The evidence is irrefutable." Helena nodded, though concern still shadowed her amber eyes. "And Lord Harrington? What defense will he mount?" "He will focus not on the facts which favor us entirely, but on my judgment." Dominic's mouth tightened. "He will suggest that my decision to restore your property was influenced by personal considerations." "A claim not entirely without merit," Helena observed, with the honesty that had become the cornerstone of their relationship. Dominic reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "The restoration was warranted regardless of any feelings between us. I would have returned the property upon discovering the fraud, even had you been an elderly gentleman with a disagreeable disposition rather than—" He paused, his gaze traveling appreciatively over her face. "Rather than the most remarkable woman of my acquaintance." A flush of pleasure colored Helena's cheeks at the compliment, though she maintained her practical focus. "The Lords may not share your certainty. They will see what they expect to see. A duke besotted with a woman beneath his station, making impulsive decisions that undermine the established order. Then I shall disabuse them of such notions," Dominic replied firmly. "The law is on our side, Helena. Justice does not bend to social prejudice, however deeply entrenched." His confidence, while admirable, did not entirely dispel her unease. The past weeks had brought increasing evidence of society's resistance to their unorthodox arrangement. Invitations to Brackenmere had dwindled to nearly nothing. Several families had withdrawn their children from the local school funded by the Duke's charity, citing concerns about moral influence. Even the vicar had begun making veiled references in his sermons to the dangers of disregarding divinely ordained social hierarchies. "I wish I could accompany you," Helena said softly, voicing a desire she had kept private until now. "To face them together as we promised." Dominic's expression softened. "Nothing would give me greater strength than your presence. But your absence serves our strategy better at this juncture. It allows me to present the case on purely legal grounds, without the distraction your appearance would inevitably cause." Though the reasoning was sound, Helena felt the sting of being once again relegated to waiting and watching while others determined her fate. It was the position women of all stations occupied, she reflected. Even Lady Eleanor, with all her privileges, ultimately depended upon her brother's goodwill for her security and status. "I have something for you," Dominic said, interrupting her thoughts. He withdrew a small velvet box from his waistcoat pocket, placing it on the table between them. "I intended to save this for a more auspicious moment, but perhaps now is better. A reminder of what awaits beyond these immediate trials." Helena stared at the box, her pulse quickening. "Dominic, it is not what you might think," he assured her, pushing it gently toward her. "Or rather, not yet what you might think. Please open it." With trembling fingers, Helena lifted the lid to reveal a small golden key nestled on a bed of dark velvet. She looked up questioningly, finding Dominic's eyes warm with anticipation. "The key to Hawthorne Cottage," he explained. "The final documents were recorded yesterday. The property is now legally and irrevocably yours, Helena Winters, regardless of what the Lords may say about my judgment or character." Tears of gratitude and relief welled in Helena's eyes as she lifted the key from its velvet nest. After so many years of displacement and service, after the cruel injustice that had robbed her family of their modest security, this small piece of metal represented restoration beyond price. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the key to her heart. For justice, yes, but more for understanding what this means. Not merely property, but home, Dominic finished for her. The foundation of security and identity, what my father took from you in his greed. Helena nodded, unable to speak past the emotion that closed her throat. How completely this man understood her, despite the vast differences in their experiences. The Duke of Ravenswood, heir to thousands of acres and a fortune beyond counting, comprehended the profound significance of 10 acres and a cottage to a woman who had owned nothing but her few clothes and mementos for most of her adult life. "There is something else," Dominic continued, his voice taking on a new gravity. "Something I must ask before I depart for London." Helena's heart stuttered in her chest at his tone. "Yes? These past months have shown me with increasing clarity that my happiness, indeed my very ability to be the man I wish to be, depends upon your presence in my life." He took her free hand, the one not clutching the precious key. "I go to London to defend not merely a property transfer, but my right to determine my own future, to choose a path based on character rather than convention." "What are you saying, Dominic?" Helena asked, though a part of her already knew, had perhaps known since that day in the carriage when he had first confessed his feelings. "I am asking if you will consider becoming my wife," he said simply. "Not today, not tomorrow, but when these storms have passed. When we have shown the world that our commitment is neither fleeting nor frivolous." Though she had half expected the words, their impact was nonetheless profound. Helena sat motionless, the key warm in one hand, Dominic's fingers clasping the other, as the full implications of his proposal washed over her. "The Duchess of Ravenswood," she said, testing the incongruous title on her tongue. "A former lady's maid. The scandal would be unprecedented." "The scandal will fade," Dominic insisted. "Quality endures. Those with sense enough to know you will recognize your worth transcends artificial barriers of birth and station. And those without such sense, the peers who will snub me, the ladies who will refuse my invitations, the servants who will resent taking orders from one who once worked alongside them." Dominic's gaze remained steady. "They will adapt, as people always do when confronted with immutable reality. Not overnight, perhaps not even within a year, but eventually your grace, your intelligence, and your compassion will win respect, if not universal acceptance." Helena studied his face, seeking any hint of doubt or hesitation. Finding none, she allowed herself to envision the future he proposed, herself as mistress of Brackenmere, working alongside Dominic to manage the vast estates, to improve conditions for tenants and servants, to create the family he had described so tenderly, children running through halls once shadowed by his father's cruelty. "I will not give you my answer now," she said finally. "Not because I doubt my heart, but because you must face the Lords without the additional burden of an engagement. Return from London victorious, and we shall speak of this again." Though disappointment flickered briefly in his eyes, Dominic nodded in understanding. "As always, your practical wisdom guides us well. But may I at least know if your hesitation stems from doubt of my constancy or merely from prudent strategy?" Helena smiled then, a radiant expression that transformed her serious countenance. "I have never doubted your constancy, Dominic Blackwood. From the moment you handed me my brother's box and promised justice, I have known you to be a man of your word." Relief washed over his features. "Then I shall go to London with hope in my heart, if not a formal understanding between us." "Take this as well," Helena said impulsively, pressing the cottage key back into his hand, "not as rejection of your gift, but as a talisman. Let it remind you of what we fight for. The right to determine our own destinies, to build our own homes, whether humble cottages or great estates, according to the dictates of justice and love." Dominic closed his fingers around the key, deeply moved by the symbolic gesture. "I shall carry it close to my heart until I return." "See that you do," Helena replied, her tone lightening though her eyes remained serious, "for I expect its return, along with its bearer, in no more than a fortnight. Hawthorne Cottage has waited long enough for proper care, as have I." The boldness of her statement, the clear acknowledgement of her feelings despite her deferred answer, brought a smile to Dominic's face that erased years of care from his features. In that moment he looked not like the forbidding Duke of Ravenswood, but like the young man who had once quoted Wordsworth through gritted teeth, who had played pianoforte in darkened rooms, who had shown kindness to a footman with unusual amber eyes. "A fortnight," he agreed, raising her hand to his lips in a gesture that bridged propriety and passion. "Not a day longer, I swear it." And as April sunshine bathed them in its hopeful light, Helena allowed herself to believe that perhaps, against all odds, Love might indeed transcend the ancient barriers of class and circumstance, not through blind rebellion against social order, but through the patient courage to stand firm in the face of prejudice, to demonstrate through quiet dignity that true nobility resided in character rather than title. 5 years had passed since that fateful April, when Dominic Blackwood, Duke of Ravenswood, had journeyed to London to defend his right to determine his own destiny. The gardens of Brackenmere Hall bloomed now in the full glory of early summer, roses climbing ancient walls, lavender scenting the air with its soothing fragrance. Beneath the sprawling oak tree where Helena had once knelt in solitary grief, a blanket had been spread upon the grass, its occupants sheltered from the afternoon sun by the tree's generous canopy. "Again, Papa," demanded a small girl of 3 years, her amber eyes so like her mother's, alight with excitement as she clutched a wooden horse in her tiny hands. "Make him gallop again," Dominic obliged, setting aside the estate ledger he had been reviewing to lift his daughter onto his knee. "Very well, Lady Elizabeth, but this shall be the final performance before your brother awakens from his nap." As if on cue, a soft cry emanated from the Moses basket resting in the shade nearby. Helena, who had been embroidering a handkerchief with quiet concentration, set aside her work to attend to the infant boy whose arrival 2 months earlier had completed their happiness. "Too late," she said with a smile, lifting the child into her arms. "Young Master James appears ready to join the entertainment." Dominic watched as his wife settled back onto the blanket, their son cradled against her shoulder, her face radiant with maternal contentment. Even now, after years of marriage, the sight of Helena still stirred his heart with a mixture of wonder and gratitude. That fate had brought her to Brackenmere, that courage had enabled them to overcome the formidable obstacles to their union, that love had proven stronger than centuries of rigid social convention. The path had not been easy. The Duke's presentation to the House of Lords had indeed vindicated his decision to restore the Winters property, the evidence of his father's fraud too substantial to dismiss. Yet his announcement, 6 months later, of his engagement to the former lady's maid had sparked precisely the scandal Helena had predicted. Several prominent families had publicly severed connections with the Ravenswoods. Anonymous letters had arrived at Brackenmere, filled with vicious accusations and dire predictions. The Queen herself had summoned Dominic to express her grave reservations about the match. Through it all, Helena had maintained the quiet dignity that had first drawn him to her, neither apologizing for her humble origins nor attempting to disguise them with affected manners. "I am who I am," she had declared on the evening of their first public appearance as an engaged couple, when Lady Harrington had deliberately turned her back at the village assembly. Neither more nor less worthy of respect than any other person who strives to live honorably. The wedding, held at Brackenmere's chapel the following spring, had been attended by fewer peers than tradition might have dictated, but the tenants and servants had filled the pews to capacity, their genuine affection for the couple evident in the flowers that lined the path from hall to chapel, in the handcrafted gifts presented at the wedding breakfast, in the tears that glistened in Mrs. Graves's eyes as she watched Helena process down the aisle on Lord Tallis's arm. "You are wool-gathering again, husband?" Helena's voice, warm with amusement, broke into Dominic's reverie. She had shifted the now quieted James to a more comfortable position against her shoulder, her free hand extended to reclaim Elizabeth, who had grown restless on her father's knee. "Merely appreciating my good fortune," he replied, relinquishing their daughter, who immediately began playing with the ribbon of her mother's gown. "It occurs to me that we have reached the 5-year anniversary of my journey to London, the journey that set us on this path." Helena's expression softened with remembrance. "You returned victorious, as I knew you would, thanks in no small part to the talisman you provided." Dominic reached into his waistcoat pocket, withdrawing the golden key to Hawthorne Cottage, the same key he had presented to Helena that April morning, the key she had returned to him as a symbol of their shared struggle for justice and self-determination. He still carried it with him always, a tangible reminder of how close they had come to missing the happiness they now shared. "Have you visited the cottage this week?" he asked, knowing that despite her duties as Duchess and mother, Helena made regular pilgrimages to the property that had been her first independent home. "Yesterday," she confirmed. "The roses are blooming magnificently, and Mrs. Collins has the vegetable garden well in hand. She sends her regards, along with more preserves than we could possibly consume in a month of Sundays." The arrangement had evolved naturally after their marriage. Unable to occupy Hawthorne Cottage herself once she became Duchess, Helena had offered the tenancy to a widow from the village whose husband had died in a mining accident, leaving her with 3 children to support. Mrs. Collins now managed the property beautifully, paying a nominal rent that went directly into a fund for educating the children of tenant farmers, a project especially dear to Helena's heart. "And did you visit the oak as well?" Dominic inquired, his tone softening. They both knew which oak he meant, the ancient tree in Hawthorne's garden, where Helena had insisted on placing a proper memorial stone for her brother once the cottage was fully restored. "I did," she smiled, though a shadow of old grief passed briefly across her features. "The wildflowers we planted have taken root around the stone. It looks peaceful, as I believe Eamon would have wished." Dominic reached across the blanket to take her hand, mindful of the sleeping infant on her shoulder. "He would be proud of all you've accomplished, Helena. The school for tenant children, the improved conditions for the staff, the medical clinic in the village. These are not merely acts of charity, but of justice. The justice he sought. The justice we both seek," she corrected gently. "For these are as much your accomplishments as mine, Dominic. You provided not only the means, but the moral courage to challenge traditions that no longer serve humanity's best interests." Their fingers intertwined upon the blanket, the golden bands on their left hands catching the dappled sunlight that filtered through the oak's canopy. So much had changed in 5 years, yet the essential character of their relationship remained constant. Mutual respect, shared purpose, and a love that had proven more durable than the social prejudices arrayed against it. "Your Grace!" The call came from the direction of the house, where Pembroke was approaching with a letter in hand. "A message has arrived from London, most urgent, by the seal." Dominic reluctantly released Helena's hand to accept the missive, breaking the official seal with practiced ease. His expression remained impassive as he scanned the contents, though something in his posture caused Helena to study him more intently. "What is it?" she asked once Pembroke had retreated out of earshot. "Not Lord Harrington again, I hope?" A smile tugged at Dominic's mouth. "No, my dear. Lord Harrington appears to have finally accepted the immutability of our situation. This comes from the palace. It seems Her Majesty has decided to grace Brackenmere with a royal visit next month, during her journey to the northern counties." Helena's eyes widened, her free hand instinctively rising to her throat where a familiar red silk ribbon, her mother's last beautiful possession, was now adorned with a modest pearl brooch, Dominic's gift upon Elizabeth's birth. "The Queen? Here? After her initial reservations about our marriage?" "It would appear that 5 years of exemplary conduct as Duchess of Ravenswood has softened Her Majesty's position," Dominic replied, a note of pride evident in his voice. "The letter specifically mentions your work with the tenant schools and the medical clinic." "How extraordinary," Helena murmured, her mind already calculating the preparations such a visit would require. "Mrs. Graves will be beside herself with excitement," Dominic laughed, the sound startling a pair of doves from a nearby shrub. "The entire household will be in an uproar, but I have complete faith in the Duchess's ability to manage the chaos with her customary grace." The Duchess. Even now, after years of answering to the title, Helena occasionally experienced moments of dissonance, brief instances when she caught herself wondering how the girl who had once polished silver in this very house had come to preside over it as mistress, not through any calculated design or ambitious scheme, but through the simple courage to stand firm in her convictions, to believe in the possibility of justice even when the world seemed arrayed against it. "What are you thinking, my love?" Dominic asked, observing the pensive expression that had settled on his wife's features. "I was remembering the night you sent your guards to spy on me," Helena replied, a smile softening the memory's edge. "How terrified I was when you summoned me to your study the next morning, certain I would be dismissed without a character, and I was certain you were engaged in some nefarious plot against the household," Dominic admitted ruefully. "How blind we both were in our different ways." "Not blind," Helena corrected, shifting the sleeping James to her other shoulder with practiced ease, "merely unable to see beyond the barriers society had erected between us. It took courage, yours as much as mine, to imagine a different possibility." Elizabeth, growing bored with adult conversation, had begun arranging a collection of small pebbles and fallen oak leaves into elaborate patterns on the blanket. Dominic watched his daughter's serious concentration, so reminiscent of her mother's methodical approach to challenges. "I sometimes wonder," he said quietly, "what might have happened had I not looked out the window that night, had I not witnessed your private grief beneath this very tree." Helena considered the question, her gaze traveling from her daughter's bent head to the ancient oak above them. its branches stretching protectively over their family circle. I believe our paths would have crossed eventually, though perhaps in different circumstances. Some connections, Dominic, seem written in the stars rather than in social conventions. A romantic notion from my practical duchess? He teased gently. Whatever would the Queen say? She would say, I imagine, that even monarchs must bow to the dictates of the heart upon occasion. Helena's amber eyes, still her most arresting feature, held his with the directness that had never dimmed through years of marriage. As we all must, if we are to live authentically. Dominic leaned forward, pressing a tender kiss to her forehead, a gesture that remained intensely meaningful to them both, echoing as it did the first public acknowledgement of their attachment before assembled guests at the harvest ball that had marked their official betrothal. To living authentically, he murmured against her skin, and to the woman who taught a duke the true meaning of nobility. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the grounds of Brackenmere Hall, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenswood remained beneath the oak tree, their children between them, their hard-won happiness a testament to the enduring power of justice, courage, and love to transform lives, and perhaps, in some small measure, the world itself. In the silent theatre of our lives, it is not the grandeur of our titles, but the quiet dignity of our choices that defines true nobility. The Duke and Helena teach us that justice flourishes not in the preservation of outdated traditions, but in the courage to challenge them when they no longer serve humanity's higher purpose. Their journey reminds us that the most formidable barriers between souls are not those erected by society, but those we maintain within our hearts through fear of change and judgment. Love, when authentic, does not see stations or ranks. It recognizes only the essential character that persists beneath all external trappings. It takes greater courage to defy convention for the sake of principle than to sacrifice principle for the comfort of conformity. Like the Duke who sent his guards to spy on the maid, we often approach others with suspicion born of prejudice, only to discover that in witnessing their private grace, we confront the limitations of our own perspective. Perhaps the most profound truth illustrated by this tale is that redemption is possible, not just for individuals, but for legacies tainted by past injustice. The son who chose to heal the wounds inflicted by his father's cruelty reminds us that we are not bound by inheritance, whether of title or temperament. We can choose, as Helena did, to face our fears rather than flee them, to seek understanding rather than nurture bitterness, to build love where hatred might more easily grow. In the end, what haunts us is not what we discover about others, but what we learn about ourselves in the witnessing. The snow may cover many secrets, but it cannot bury forever the truth of who we are and who we might become when we find the courage to see beyond the boundaries of expectation to the infinite possibilities of the human heart. Dear reader, if the Duke and Helena's journey from suspicion to love has touched your heart, I invite you to share in the conversation. Has there been a moment in your life when you discovered that someone was entirely different from your initial judgment? Have you ever found courage to defy expectation for the sake of what you knew to be right? Subscribe to our channel to receive more tales of redemption, courage, and love that transcend society's boundaries. Each week, we explore the hidden depths of human connection through stories that challenge us to look beyond appearances to the true character beneath. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on the Duke and Helena's journey. What moment in their story resonated most deeply with you? Your perspective enriches our community and reminds us that though these characters lived in Victorian England, their struggles and triumphs mirror our own quest for authenticity in a world that often values conformity above truth. So until our next journey together through time and heart, remember that some connections are indeed written in the stars, rather than in social conventions, and those are the ones worth fighting for.